You get the recording? There we go. Recording in progress. Okay, so I had the privilege actually of meeting Marianne in person this March at the Tucson Festival of Books, where not only was she there with her book and doing book signings and sales, and it was a very successful event. I highly recommend that festival for any reader. But I also got to see her speak on a panel, which was actually a sold out room along with Susan Ito, and just really enjoyed meeting this very, very gentle and lovely lady. So Marianne Novy, the book that she's presenting here tonight is called Adoption Memoirs. Marianne is an adopted person, author, adoption scholar, and professor emerita of English and Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, who taught at the University of Pittsburgh for 40 years. She was adopted as an infant in 1945. In her 30s, Marianne met her birth mother and 7 half brothers. Long involved in adoption issues, she co founded the Alliance for the Study of Adoption and Culture, shared a mini elective in the School of Medicine to talk to medical caregivers about adoption effects on families and health implications. In her new book, Adoption Memoirs from Temple University Press, she considers 45 published memoirs by birth mothers, adoptees, and adoptive parents about same race and transracial adoption, open adoption, and reunion. And so please give a warm but quiet welcome for Marianne, who's going to take it away here.
Oh, thank you very much for that introduction. It's nice to be speaking with you today and to be seeing some old friends here. Hi, Anita. And I am going to give you a kind of a summary and talk about a number of different aspects of my book. How did I come to write a book about adoption memoirs? When I was 5, my mother told me I was adopted so I could be better taken care of, and I shouldn't talk about it because other people wouldn't understand. After I came to Pittsburgh to teach English at Pitt, I finally met other adoptees, and after months of correspondence, I met my birth mother in her home in Wisconsin. We had little in common, not even appearance, except that we wanted to connect. We did build a relationship. Later, when my teaching and writing, first on Shakespeare and then on women writers, were well underway, I wanted to relate my life as an adoptee to my work teaching and writing. After I started teaching a course on the theme of adoption and literature, I realized that the novels and plays I taught were almost entirely written by people with no experience of adoption. Albee was the exception. I did teach a few plays by Albee. And George Eliot, was a kind of adoptive mother, was a sort of exception to this. But almost all the authors were people who did not experience adoption. And frequently these books contained mythic adoption plots ending with the long-awaited adoption of an abandoned orphan or a reunion with birth parents reconstituting the original family. Or, as in Oedipus, perhaps the most famous adoption play, included a reunion that was a disaster. I wrote a book, Reading Adoption, which discussed how different these plots were from my own story. I read memoirs about adoption. Eventually, they became most of the reading in a few of my classes. I wrote this book because I wanted people to have a more realistic sense of the many different kinds of adoption experiences by reading memoirs written by people who lived adoption, birth mothers, adoptive parents, and adoptees. In my background research, I discovered that there are far more domestic adoptions of infants in the United States, between 2 and 20 times more proportionate to population than in any other developed country. This is not just because the first modern adoption law, emphasizing concern for the welfare of infants, was passed in Massachusetts in 1851. It is not just because we in the United States believe in fresh starts and not so much in hereditary privilege. It is also because Other developed countries do more federal spending on family benefits, childcare, and early childhood education so that a single mother or a poor couple might have more support in raising a child. And it is also because adoption is so widely publicized here in the United States as the best solution
How's she
to
gonna work?
win-win-win.
That's silly, right?
Yeah, yeah. Something that both political parties and most churches celebrate. In this story, the birth mother is happy to escape stigma and poverty, and the adopted child and parents live happily ever after together. This is the image that the Supreme Court majority relied on in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, revoking Roe versus Wade, making abortion more difficult to obtain in the hope of increasing the number of adoptable children. This Dobbs decision claims that, quote, a woman who puts her newborn up for adoption today has little reason to fear that the baby will not find a suitable home. Quote, but many adoption memoirists disagree, and a few birth mother memoirists discover that the adoptive parents, for example, were not prepared to deal with racial or health issues. For all the gains that children and adoptive parents may enjoy in adoption, birth mothers clearly experience losses. From the end of the Second World War until 1973, more than 1.5 million young women in what journalist Gabrielle Glaser calls a reproductive and human rights story, were funneled into an often coercive system they could neither understand nor resist. The memoirs discussed in my book's first chapter support her view. These birth mothers do not forget relinquishment, but remember it with pain. In later chapters, we see that while some adoptees recall close and happy relationships with their adoptive parents, others do not, or find those good relationships shadowed by racism or by lack of knowledge of their origins. Most memoirs by adoptees describe growing up, searching, meeting, and trying to develop a relationship. The memoirs discussed in this book often speak to each other. Adoptive parents often write that they could have used more education or more specific information to prepare them to raise their adopted children, and many adoptees agree. Reading memoirs by adoptees and adoptive parents together demonstrates that some adoptive parents are still practicing the denial that many adoptees' memoirs have been calling out for years, while others, especially concerned about adoptees and or birth parents' need for continuity, are changing adoption practices for the better. This book shows how much some adoptees appreciate parents who encourage discussions of adoption and share what they know about ancestry, and how others feel frustrated by parents who don't. Memoirs by both parents and adoptees show that transracial adoptees experience some isolation and trauma, no matter how sympathetic their parents are. The complications of relationship after reunion is one theme in most of the memoirs by adoptees and birth mothers in my book. For transnational adoptees whose birth parents spoke no English, communication is even more difficult, but it could be very loving, as Jane Jong Trenka finds with her Korean mother. Getting past the secrecy imposed by closed records to meet birth parents does not in itself solve the problem of how they and adoptees can get along. Most of these memoirs show that relationships between adoptee and birth family may be rewarding, but can take work. They might have ups and downs like a roller coaster, might turn out to be impossible, and in a few cases sound idyllic. A few birth mothers and adoptive parents write about the effect on them of reading memoirs by adoptees. One birth mother notes the adoptive parents' failure to deal with race in their adopted biracial daughter, and that daughter writes a memoir about her birth mother's own racial insensitivity. People in all positions complain about closed state records the failure of orphanages and agencies to give or share information, and even more cruelty and unethical behavior by doctors and social workers, such as allowing neglect or abuse, representing one child as another, or giving children to parents who are severely depressed or whose child-rearing practices are known to be problematic. International adoptees and adoptive parents sometimes discover that birth parents thought to be dead are still alive and believed that what they were signing was permission for a child to be educated elsewhere, expecting that the child as an adult would then return. This book provides cautionary narratives, pictures of generosity, and stories of mistakes, learning, and forgiveness. The memoirs by birth mothers I discuss all show that they want to be in touch with a child they entrusted to adoption. But on the other hand, there are variations in how this relationship develops. There is clearly a happy bond for Carol Schaefer and Janet Mason Ellerby, but for Lorraine Dusky and Jan Waldron, it is much more troubled. Margaret Moorman gets only a letter and a photo from her son, but feels good about how his life has turned out. Jan Waldron, having met and developed a complicated relationship with her daughter as a teenager, apologizes and tries for a reconciliation, but her daughter writes her own memoir, which I just mentioned, accusing Waldron of racism. All these memoirs contrast with the one by Amy Seek, who chose open adoption and thereby a continuing relationship with the child in the adoptive family from the beginning. I found an even greater variety in the stories that adoptees tell about their relationship with one or both birth parents after their meeting. Usually, the first meeting is not by any means the happy ending of the story, as in the myth about reunion. Rather, there is a complicated relationship to be worked out in various ways. Usually, adoptees are delighted to see physical similarities, but surprising to me, only two emphasize that their birth parents have values and ideals they admire and identify with. Nicole Chung, whose scholarly father understands her better than her adoptive parents, and Jaya John, whose mother studied at a seminary and whose father is a member of the NAACP and the Florida Human Relations Commission. Jaya John himself has eventually started a kind of center for spiritual and other kinds of personal education. Jeremy Harding finds it valuable to lunch with his birth mother across the class divide, observe that her wealth, unlike his, is in his extended family and friends, and calls their getting to know each other a second adoption. Some adoptees, like Catherine McKinley, Jean Strauss, and Jaya John, conclude their memoirs by affirming an identity, synthesizing what they received from all their families. A few choose a side. Biracial Rebecca Carroll, for example, identifies as Black without having a close relationship with her Black birth father. There's also much variety in memoirs by adoptive parents. Some emphasize their delight in their children's happiness. Adoptive parents who end their memoir when their children are young are especially likely to focus on how happy the adoption makes them too. Some who take the story further may recount more difficulty and may emphasize learning from mistakes. Emily Prager has to deal with her young daughter's wish for a mother who looks Chinese, Jesse Green with the period of ambiguity before he is certain that his relationship with the boy Ares and his father is permanent. Douglas Bates, who has adopted two Black daughters, must deal with racism in his community, his family, and even himself, but feels triumphant about the racially mixed wedding celebration with which the book ends. Parents who adopt children with a disability, like Michael Doris and Kimball Laux, may have the most difficult path, but Ralph Savarese rejoices in every success that his autistic, non-speaking son has, from jumping on a trampoline to writing poetry, eventually graduating with honors and helping make a film about his life. Some of them try to sympathize with their children's birth parents and even form relationships with them. But in some others don't really want to think about the birth parents. In these memoirs, I have found moving portrayals of grief, anger, courage, persistence, joy, learning, and forgiveness. I hope that my account of them will help readers understand the complexity of emotions that adoption brings and the complexity of the issues it can pose. And I hope that my book will give readers suggestions of more books to explore. This is the end of my prepared talk, and I know it's a little early, but I really hope that you will have questions. Maybe you'll have questions related to some of the specific books or situations that I mentioned, or maybe you'll have questions relating to something that you've been thinking about a lot with relation to adoption, uh, not not something that I mentioned at all that I'd be happy to talk about more. So please do tell me, and I'm going to look at the chat to see if there's something right in the chat right now. Hello, hello to Anita.